Whipped every Sunday of her childhood, a Lakota chief was the first man who did not raise a hand. The mare came in limping around sundown, no rider. I knew whose horse it was. The saddle was a cheap military surplus one, the kind that leaves sores, and the blanket beneath it was patched in 3 places with flour sack cloth. That woman had been riding that half-lame animal for 2 weeks, since the day she'd appeared at the edge of the trading camp, asking nobody in particular where a person might find a Christian congregation within a day's ride. There wasn't one, not anymore. The settlement that had been trying to grow itself into a town had dried up and blown off the summer before, and what was left of it was 2 burned walls and a well that tasted of iron. I told her that. She thanked me in a voice that had been trained out of all expression, collected her mare, and rode east. I watched her go. White Hawk, my cousin, who had a talent for saying the thing no one wanted to hear, said that woman rode like someone expecting to get hit from behind. He wasn't wrong, but I didn't say anything. The mare came back without her on the 3rd night after that. I found the woman at first light, maybe 1.5 miles down the creek draw, sitting on a rock with her knees pulled up and her boots off. 1 foot was bound in a strip torn from the hem of her skirt. The wrapping was tight and even. She'd done it herself, not panicking. The creek was low and the stones were slick with the cold, and she'd gone in somewhere. I could see where the bank had crumbled, and her heel prints dug hard into the mud as she'd climbed out. She looked at me without flinching. That was the first thing I noticed. Most white women on this land saw me and looked away or looked at the ground or showed something in their face, fear, contempt, calculation. She just looked at me the way a person looks at weather, deciding what to make of it. I handed her the mare's reins. She didn't take them right away. She looked at the horse, then at me. Then she said, "I don't have anything to pay you with." I told her the horse found its own way. She didn't owe me anything for that. She studied me a moment longer, then reached up and took the reins. Her name was Clara. I found that out later. She didn't offer it that morning. I should tell you who I was, or who I am. It's hard to say those 2 things as if they're the same. My name is Sitting Cloud, which the traders mangled into Setting Cloud and sometimes just Cloud, and I had learned to answer to all of it without much feeling. I was the son of a chief and had become a chief, and that sounds more noble than it felt most days. What it meant mostly was that a great deal of the world's trouble came and sat in front of my fire and expected me to solve it. I had 42 winters behind me at this point. A wife who had died 8 years before of the spotted sickness, taking with her a child we hadn't yet named. I had a son from before that marriage who was grown and gone north. I had a camp of 81 people who looked to me for things I could provide and things I could not. I was not a man who talked much. I found that most things either needed doing or didn't, and either way talking rarely changed the outcome. White Hawk said I had the personality of a stone post and twice the warmth. I didn't argue with him. Clara came back to the trading camp 2 days later and asked if she could work for her keep for a week or 2. She said she could sew, she could cook, she knew plants well enough to be useful. I wasn't running the trading camp. A mixed-blood Frenchman named Dupree ran that, and Dupree wasn't there. He was 3 days south buying cattle he couldn't afford. His wife, a Cheyenne woman named Bright Kettle, was managing in his absence, and she had enough sense to say yes to an extra set of hands. I watched Clara work. She was not graceful. She was efficient. There's a difference. Grace is comfortable in itself. Efficiency is what you learn when you've been told since childhood that your comfort is a sin. She chopped wood in a straight-backed, steady way that said she'd been doing it since she could lift an axe. She cooked without tasting because she'd learned early that eating before the men had eaten brought consequences. She moved through the camp like someone who was always calculating the nearest door. I noticed all of this. I said nothing about it. It was not my business. On the 4th day, a trapper came through, man named Ott, big through the shoulder, smelled of beaver musk and something sour underneath that. He watched Clara all through the midday meal, and then after, when she was washing the tin plates at the creek, he stood behind her and said something I couldn't hear from where I was. I could see her go still, the way a deer goes still, not calm, just stopped. Ott put his hand on her shoulder. I was on my feet before I decided to stand. I didn't touch him. I came around in front of him, between him and her, and I looked at him until he took his hand away and stepped back. He said something about it being a free country. I looked at him until he picked up his pack and left. Clara was still kneeling at the creek. She hadn't turned around the whole time. Her hands were flat on her thighs. When she heard his footsteps leaving, she picked up the plates again and went back to washing them. She didn't say anything to me. I went back to what I'd been doing. That night Bright Kettle asked me what I thought of the white woman, the way she asks things sideways, like she's asking about something else. I said she seemed capable. Bright Kettle looked at me with that face she had, the one that meant she thought I was being deliberately stupid. She was probably right. Clara's week became 2. Dupree came back with the cattle and found her useful enough to keep on. She'd made herself necessary in that quiet, relentless way, mending things, noting what was running low, knowing where everything went. I was at the trading camp most days because it sat on land my family had used for 3 generations, and because Dupree, whatever his flaws, dealt with my people honestly. I had a rough sort of arrangement with him. I kept trouble from drifting through. He kept prices fair and didn't water the whiskey. So Clara and I were in the same small world for the better part of 2 months. She didn't seek me out. I didn't seek her out. But a camp that size, you eat near the same fire and you cross the same ground and you end up talking the way people do when there's nowhere else to be. I learned that she was 29, that she'd come from Kansas from her father's farm, that she'd been heading to a cousin's place in the territory when the coach she was on had broken an axle, and the driver had decided it wasn't his problem anymore, leaving 4 passengers on a road that turned out to be barely a road. The other 3 had eventually found their way. She'd gone a different direction and hadn't. She said all this plainly, without looking for sympathy. I asked about the farm in Kansas. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said it was her father's church that was the real business of the place. The farm supported the congregation. The congregation supported the farm. It was very organized. I asked what her father preached. Repentance, she said. Then after a pause, and the rod that spares the child. She said it like she was reading from a page. No heat to it, no grief. I didn't say I was sorry. She hadn't said it asking for that. She was just telling me how the land lay. I said it sounded like a hard way to grow up. She looked at me then, not searching for something, just noting me, the way you'd mark something on a map. She said it was the only way she knew, until she left. There were 3 men I want to tell you about, because they're part of it. The first was a drunk named Mercer who came through in October, right as the weather was turning. He had no business being there and Dupree didn't want his custom. The man's reputation came ahead of him by about a day, but he came in anyway, and by the second night he decided he had some kind of claim on Clara, based on nothing I could identify. He'd talked to her once. She'd handed him a biscuit. That seemed to have been enough for him. I told him she wasn't available for what he had in mind. He told me where to go. I picked him up by the front of his coat, not roughly, and set him down outside the camp perimeter and told him to keep moving. He left, swearing in 2 languages. One of my younger men thought it was the funniest thing he'd seen all season and wouldn't stop imitating it for 3 days. Clara, when she heard about it, said nothing to me. But the next morning she put a cup of coffee outside my lodge without knocking, and when I came out she was already gone. It was good coffee. She made it strong. I understood this was her way of saying thank you when she didn't know how to say thank you, when she'd learned that accepting help meant owing something, and she hadn't figured out yet that wasn't how it worked with me. The second man was worse. A buyer from somewhere east, well-dressed, hat that cost more than some men make in a month. He spent 2 days at the camp looking at horses and looking at Clara in the same appraising way, and when he made his offer, and he did make one openly to Dupree, as if she were inventory, I wasn't there. I heard about it from White Hawk. I went and found the man in the morning before he'd saddled up. I told him what I thought of the offer. I wasn't loud about it. He looked at me the way men like him look at something they're calculating whether it's worth the trouble to push against. He decided it wasn't. He paid for his horses and left. Dupree told me later that the man had asked whose woman she was, meaning had someone already laid a claim. Dupree had apparently said, in the way Dupree had of saying things, that she was under my protection, which wasn't a phrase I'd used, but it was accurate enough. I didn't correct it. The third man was her father. He showed up in November, first hard frost already down, ground ringing like iron under the horses. He was not what I expected. A smaller man than I'd built in my head, thin, with a careful beard and eyes that moved over everything and recorded it all. He had 2 men with him, church deacons or the like, both big, both quiet. He asked Dupree for his daughter. Dupree sent someone for me. I came and stood in the doorway of the trading post, and I looked at this man who had used God's name as the handle on the thing he'd used to hit her. He looked at me and he was afraid. He was good at hiding it, but he was afraid. That told me something. He said his daughter was a runaway and a sinner, and it was his Christian duty to bring her home. I said I didn't see how it concerned me what his duty was. He said the woman was his by law and by God and by blood. I looked at him a long time without saying anything. Then I told him she was not here. I told him the camp had not seen anyone matching what he described. I told him if he and his men wanted a meal before they moved on, they were welcome to it. He knew I was lying. He looked at me and he knew. But the 2 men with him were watching me, and they were doing the same calculation the buyer had done, whether it was worth the trouble, and the answer was the same. They stayed the night. They left in the morning. Clara had spent those hours in the back of my cousin's lodge, not hidden, just not visible from the parts of camp a stranger would walk through. She knew her father had come. Bright Kettle had told her. She didn't ask me what happened. She waited until I came back past the lodge, and then she came to the doorway and looked at me, and I said he was gone. She let out a breath that must have been sitting in her chest for hours. Then she said quietly, "He'll come back." I said he might. She said, "You can't keep doing this," meaning making herself my problem. I told her she wasn't a problem. I told her the man was a bully, and bullies need only understand that the cost of what they want is more than they're willing to pay. She looked at me for a long time with those level eyes. She said, "Why?" I didn't understand the question at first. She said, "Why do you keep?" And she stopped and started again. "You don't know me, you don't owe me anything." I thought about how to say it right. I said that what a man does or doesn't do tells people who he is, and I'd rather be known as a man who doesn't leave a woman to drown than one who watches it happen and finds reasons not to care. She looked at the ground. Her jaw was tight. She wasn't about to cry. I don't think she'd let herself cry in a long time. It was something else. It was the look of a person who had been given something they didn't have a place to put yet. She said, "I don't know how to do this." I said, "Do what?" She said, "Trust someone who doesn't want something back." I said I probably wanted something eventually. Everybody did, but not the things she'd been taught to expect, and I'd tell her plain if that changed. She almost smiled, almost. It was the first time I'd seen her face do that. Winter came hard that year. The Sioux always say the winters that come hardest are the ones that matter most. My grandmother said it. I don't know if it's true, but that one stayed with me. Clara wintered at the camp. It wasn't a decision anyone made out loud. It just became the arrangement. Dupree had the space. She'd earned her keep 3 times over. The cold came fast, and there was nowhere better for her to go. I was at the camp more days than not. Not because of her, or not only. There were things to manage. A band of young men from further north who thought Dupree's horses looked better in their possession. A dispute between 2 families that needed settling. The usual winter work of keeping 81 people fed and not killing each other. But there were evenings. She was learning some Lakota words. She was serious about it, writing the sounds in a small notebook with a pencil worn to a stub. She'd ask me to say a word again, then again, until she had it right. She was not patient with herself when she got it wrong. She expected herself to be perfect at things the first time. I could see that in her, the habit of it, the way a child holds its breath expecting to be corrected. I told her that language is not something you get right all at once. It lives in the mouth a long time before it settles. She said her father used to hit her when she mispronounced the scripture verses she had to recite. She said it plainly, not looking for my reaction. I felt something move through me that I kept off my face. Not pity, she didn't want pity, something else. The kind of cold, specific anger that doesn't burn fast but stays. I said that a man who does that to a child is not a man who deserves the word. She was quiet. Then she said, he thought he was doing right. I said a lot of people think they're doing right. That doesn't mean they are. She nodded slowly, like she was writing it down somewhere. We sat by the fire for a while without talking. The wind came hard against the walls and the fire shifted. She said, "You never raise your voice." I said there wasn't usually a reason to. She said, "Not even with the men who make trouble." I said, "No, loud doesn't make you right, it just makes you loud." She thought about this. Then she said, "He screamed, every Sunday mostly. The sermon first, then," she stopped. Her hands were flat on her thighs the way they'd been at the creek that first morning. I didn't say anything. I let the fire say it. After a while she said, "Sundays were the worst days." I said they sounded like it. She said, "I haven't been to a church since I left. I thought I'd miss it." A pause. "I don't." I nodded. She looked at me across the fire. She said, "Do your people have something like that, prayer services?" I told her we had ceremony. I told her some of what it looked like. I told her the difference as I understood it. That ceremony is not about being afraid of what happens if you don't come, and it's not about being made to feel small before something that will punish you. It's about being part of something larger than you and knowing you belong to it. She listened to all of this carefully. She said, "That sounds better." I said it was better for me. I couldn't speak for hers. She said, "You speak for everything else. You might as well." And there it was, that almost smile again, and this time it went further. I felt something in my chest ease that I hadn't known was tight. January. White Hawk found me one morning outside the lodge sharpening a knife I didn't need sharpened, which he identified correctly as an indication of a man with something on his mind. He sat down and watched me for a while. Then he said, "You know everyone in 3 camps can see it." I said I didn't know what he was talking about. He made a sound that indicated he thought I was, again, being deliberately stupid. I kept working the knife. He said, "She's a good woman." I said she was. He said, "Capable, not soft, knows her own mind." I said yes. He said, "Doesn't look at you like you're a curiosity, which is more than most." I didn't say anything. He said, "And you've been sitting outside in the cold sharpening a knife for 20 minutes. I looked at the blade. He had a point. He left me to it. I sat there a while longer, thinking about what I knew, which was this. I was not a young man anymore. I had buried enough people to know how short time was and how fast the thing you're waiting for turns into the thing you missed. I had spent 8 years being a chief and a widower and not much else, and I had been fine with that because fine was what I had. And then this woman had come riding into my life on a limping mare, and she had looked at me without flinching, and she had been so tightly wound around her own survival that she didn't know yet that it was all right to put it down for a minute. And I wanted to be the place where she could put it down. That was the whole of it. I sat with that a while, out in the cold, until I was sure I knew it. I found her that afternoon at the edge of camp, where she went sometimes to be away from people. She was sitting on a rock looking at the frozen creek, and she had that expression she got when she was thinking hard about something she hadn't resolved. I sat down a few feet away. After a while she said, "My father will come back in the spring." I said, "Probably." She said, "I've been trying to figure out what I have to do, where I can go that's far enough." I said there were places, north or further west. She nodded, still looking at the creek. Then she said, "I don't want to go." I looked at her. She turned and looked at me. Those level eyes, no performance in them. She said, "I don't want to keep running, and I don't." She stopped, started again. "This is the first place where I've felt." She pressed her lips together, working on the word. Then, steady. "This is the first place I've felt steady in a long time." I said I was glad to hear that. She said, "Is that why, or is it you?" I said, "Both, probably." She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "I don't know how to do this." And I recognized it. She'd said it before, months ago. "I don't know how to trust someone who doesn't want something back." I said, "Neither do I anymore." And that was true. 8 years is long enough to forget the weight of it. She looked at me for a long time. The cold was coming off the creek, and her breath showed in the air, and her hands were in her lap, and she was still, but not the way she'd been still that first morning at the creek, not braced, just present. She said, "All right." That was it, all right, 2 words. I took her hand. It was cold, and she let me hold it, and after a moment she turned her palm up and held back. We sat there until the light went. Spring came, as springs do, without asking permission. Her father came as predicted, not with the 2 deacons this time, but with a man who wore a badge and carried papers, some kind of territorial legal document he'd gotten somewhere. I read the papers. I'd been taught English young, and I read better than most people expected, which was a thing I had used to my advantage more than once. The document said a good deal of words that added up, more or less, to her father's belief that she was his property. I handed it back. The lawman looked at me. He said he was just doing his job, and I could see he was uncomfortable, which meant he was a man with some sense. I told him the territory's laws applied to the territory's settlements, and that this camp stood on land governed by a treaty that was currently still in effect. Not by much, not for long probably, but still in effect, and that within its terms, the document in his hand was not something I was required to honor. I told him the woman was here of her own will, and would leave of her own will, or not at all. The lawman thought about this. He looked at the papers again. Her father started to say something, and I looked at him, just looked at him, and something in my face closed off whatever he was about to say. The lawman said he'd have to report back and figure out the legal question. He said he wasn't going to force the issue today. Her father said her name. She was standing 20 feet behind me, and I hadn't known until then how she'd come out because I hadn't turned around. She'd come to stand behind me, and she'd done it of her own choosing. She looked at her father. She said, "I'm not coming home." He said she was his daughter, and she was sinning. She said she'd made her peace with that. He looked at me. Something moved across his face. I'd call it hatred, but it was sharper than that. It was the look of a man who understood that there was something between her and the world now that hadn't been there before, and that he couldn't reach through it. He said, "What are you to her?" I said, "Everything you weren't." He left. The lawman tipped his hat and went after him. I stood there a moment, and then I felt her hand touch my back, just between my shoulder blades, the flat of her palm steady, like someone checking to make sure a door is solid. I didn't move. Her hand stayed there. Then she came around and stood beside me, and we watched her father's horses disappear into the distance until they were just a mark on the land, and then not even that. I want to be careful about what I say next, because it's easy to make it sound like things become simple after the hard part is over. They don't. Clara had a long way to go learning that it was safe to eat before the men, that her misspoken word was not going to bring down anything on her head, that a raised hand might just be someone reaching for the salt. She still went still sometimes in the old way. I learned to recognize it and to just keep doing whatever I was doing until it passed, not to acknowledge it, not to crowd her, just to stay steady the same. She was 29, and most of her body had been taught things that would take years to unteach. I was 42, and most of me had been taught to expect to work alone, and that too takes years. We had years, or we decided to act like we did, which is the same thing. There was an evening that summer, maybe 3 months after her father had come and gone, when she was grinding corn and I was at the table doing the accounts Dupree always needed help with, and White Hawk's youngest daughter was chasing a dog around the camp and shrieking with laughter, and the light was that long amber light of early summer that makes everything look like it's been there forever. Clara looked up from the grinding, and she watched the girl and the dog for a moment, and then she looked at me. She didn't say anything. I didn't say anything. But her face was open in a way I hadn't seen it, not guarded, not calculating the nearest door. Just open. Present in the way that means you're not braced for what's coming because you're not expecting something to come. I went back to the accounts. She went back to the grinding. Later she brought me coffee. I think about that evening more than most. The dog, the light, the grinding stone, the unremarkable fact of 2 people in the same quiet space who didn't need to be on guard. I had been a chief for 20 years and a widower for 8 and a man alone for longer than that, and I knew what it was to be depended on and what it was to be needed, but I had mostly known those things from the outside in, the shape of my usefulness to other people. She gave me something different. She looked at me like I was enough, like I didn't need to be performing the job of chief or the job of protector or the job of any kind of man. Like I could just sit at the table doing someone's accounts in the amber light of summer, and that was fine. That was enough. That was, in fact, exactly right. You spend enough years being what everyone needs, you start to forget that was ever separate from who you are. She reminded me. Her father never came back. Maybe the legal ground was shakier than he'd planned on. Maybe something else. I don't know. She stopped waiting for him around the second winter, which I measured by the way she slept lighter for a long time than not. We stayed at Dupree's camp another year, then built on land a half-day's ride east, in a valley with a creek and a south-facing slope that held the warmth. White Hawk helped build, and a young man named Takes Two Horses who decided for reasons of his own that he wanted to learn carpentry, and Clara's hands on the work alongside ours. The valley had been called something in the old language for generations, a name that meant something about red stone. Trappers had been calling it something else for 10 years. A few of the homesteaders who came through that next spring called it Clouds Valley. I didn't correct them. Clara heard someone say it once and she looked at me sideways, and I looked straight ahead, and she laughed, a real laugh, not polite, from the chest, and she said, "Clouds Valley." I said it would do. She was shaking her head, but she was still smiling. I looked out at the south-facing slope, the red stone, the creek bending away through the cottonwoods. Takes Two Horses was up on the roof fixing shingles, and White Hawk was arguing with him about the angle. Clara leaned against my shoulder. Just for a moment, she wasn't a woman who leaned easily, still wasn't, probably never would be entirely. But she did then. I stayed still. I was 44 years old in Clouds Valley, and I had a roof that didn't leak and an argument on top of it, and a woman beside me who'd been whipped every Sunday of her childhood by a man who called it God's work. And now, She was standing in the long afternoon light with her shoulder against mine, which was the quietest, most ordinary thing I'd ever known, worth more than any of the things I'd spent my life earning. That's the whole of it,